Order. Welcome to meeting number 14 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs. We recognize that we meet on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people, pursuant to Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Wednesday, September 24, 2025. The committee is continuing its study of Indigenous policing and public safety. I'd like to welcome our first panel, but before I get too far, those that are joining us online, if you need to get the chair's attention, please use the raise hand function, and the clerk and myself will call on you. And today we have with us Garden River First Nation Chief Karen Bell by video conference. She is just joining. We may have to suspend and check the audio. The audio has been challenging, to say the least, over the last couple of weeks, so we'll make sure it works for the interpreters. In person, we have Sandra Delaronde, project lead for Giganaway-Mananig. Say it so I can...
Giganaway-Mananig.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for joining us. I know you tried on in video before, and it didn't work. So thank you for traveling and appearing here in person. You will have 5 minutes. So please, Sandra, begin.
Okay. So thank you very much, Mr. Chair, for giving me the opportunity to come and present in person. I really feel committed to this issue, and particularly bringing an urban Indigenous lens to Indigenous policing is critical. So, and also thank you to the committee members as well for creating the space here and for the opportunity to meet here with you today. Our name, Giganaway-Mananig, means we all take care of them. And this name was given to us in a ceremony that was conducted by matriarchs. We are a Manitoba-wide network of First Nations, Red River Métis and Inuit families, knowledge keepers, urban Indigenous-led organizations, Two-Spirit-led, and First Nations Métis and Inuit representative organizations and governments. The City of Winnipeg and the Province of Manitoba also sit at our table. Our network first came together many years ago to call for the national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. In 2024, the federal and provincial governments entrusted Giganaway-Mananig to carry out a province-wide engagement process on the development of a redress alert system to mobilize police and public response in the critical hours and days after a First Nations, Métis, or Inuit woman, girl, or gender diverse relative goes missing. We released our final report yesterday in Winnipeg on the plan to implement the redress alert in our province. I'd like to share some of the findings of that engagement process because these findings speak directly to the importance of Indigenous policing. First, we heard countless examples of the wide gulf in trust between non-Indigenous police services and the Indigenous communities they are meant to serve. In fact, we heard from many community members who said that even if they feared for the life of a loved one, they would be reluctant to go to police. We heard examples of family members turning to community organizations, to Indigenous leadership, and even fire departments because they don't trust the police. We also heard accounts of missing persons never even being reported. The other key theme from our dialogue sessions is closely connected to the issue of mistrust. What we heard many times is that family and community members who do not go to the RCMP and the city police to report a missing loved one are too often not being listened to. They have been treated dismissively or rudely, This adds to the trauma experienced by families and communities, and we feel it undermines the effectiveness of any investigation. In fact, we heard numerous examples of police telling family members that they should go away and only come back once more time has passed. This is continuing to happen in the province of Manitoba, even after the national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And it is happening in the midst of a period of unprecedented public awareness and government acknowledgement of the threats facing Indigenous women, girls, and gender-diverse persons. This is why we are recommending the creation of an Indigenous-led Redress Alert organization to serve as the first point of contact for Indigenous families and communities to ensure that their concerns are heard and to help ensure a quick response when a loved one goes missing. Our findings illustrate the critical importance of the full implementation of the Calls to Justice 9.1 to 9.11, which emphasizes systemic change needed to ensure the safety and security of Indigenous women, girls, gender-diverse people, and our families, communities, and nations. In Manitoba, we are fortunate to have a First Nations police service. I have seen for myself the Indigenous policing services are better able to serve Indigenous communities. They understand the importance of culture and protocol. They are prepared to work with family members in a trauma-informed way. This builds trust and produces better results for community safety and community healing. Unfortunately, the majority of First Nations, Red River Métis, and Inuit do not benefit from the Indigenous policing model because we live in urban centres under the jurisdiction of city police. That's why there must be also investment in Indigenous police services that must go hand in hand with the creation of dedicated units within all police forces, staffed by Indigenous officers and resourced to support the need of Indigenous peoples. We've already seen that where RCMP and municipal police services employ First Nations and Métis officers, the cultural competency that they bring to their role makes a significant difference in their ability to serve Indigenous communities. We believe that these two approaches can complement and support each other. The parallel development of Indigenous police services and dedicated units within non-Indigenous police services and collaboration across these two systems will increase the number of culturally competent police officers serving in our communities. It will also build the relationships and trust, understanding that we need to ensure the safety and security of all First Nations, Red River Métis, and Inuit people in Manitoba, with particular emphasis on the safety of our women, girls, and gender-diverse people. Thank you for listening, and I would be prepared to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. First round will be 6 minutes, and for the Conservatives, we have MP.
Chief Karen Bell.
She wasn't on, sorry, no.
Oh, she's not on?
No, she's having technical difficulties once again, so if she does come on, he will signal me and we will test her. We'll suspend briefly, and then we'll just test her and then go from there. So
Test her now again, or are we going to just go into it? It'd be nice to, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, me too.
yeah, she's still not online. No, she's just not even online right now. So if she appears online, I will suspend.
Yeah, please stop
Test
the
her,
meeting.
and then you'll have the
Yeah,
opportunity
is
to ask
that
questions.
fair? If Jaime says he can start?
Jeanette wants to start, right?
Yeah, you mind if she starts?
Time at the end of
Yep.
the-
Yeah.
Yeah, if you don't mind doing the order, that's
Okay,
fine.
yeah, because
Okay.
No,
That's fair, that's fair. Thank you very much. Deputy Levac for 6 minutes.
Bonsoir. Merci beaucoup, Dr. Lalonde.
Good evening, and thank you so much, Dr. Laronde, for coming here.
See you again following yesterday's announcement on the Red Dress Alert pilot project that was announced by Giganawe Nimananig. It was a really touching and moving event to see the families and the survivors present was really something special, and I'm happy I got to take part in all of that. You've shared with us today some of of the plan. And as you said, this report does not have recommendations. It is really an action plan to put into practice, put into place the red dress alert. Could you elaborate a little bit on those, on specifically the project and what steps you want to take and what impacts you expect that will have on MMIGW2S?
Thank you for your question. I think that, first of all, the consultation process went to communities first, to families that were directly impacted, and survivors of violence and human trafficking, and they outlined the issues and presented, different ways that we can address the situation in quickly. And each of those consultations said we need this now, or we need it yesterday, and so we were really conscious of the ability to create safety, quickly for them and for all of us, actually. And so we took their responses to our essential partners, which were police services, healthcare, fire departments, and tourism and the whole hotel industry, education services, child and family, and said, as an essential partner, how can you help create safety? And so from those two reports, the team was able to build a process or a framework for a pilot project, which really is a system. But what we acknowledge in that is that technology is foundational to this work, but not everybody has access to it. So we, have to do a bit more work on that. But what technology does also is provide people that are victims an opportunity to say, yes, I'm in trouble, come and help me. Or the other concern was if people just don't want to be found, like if they're in situations of intimate partner violence, they can say, I'm not missing, I'm hiding. Can you help me? So, because oftentimes when you put out a missing persons report, it's often too late. And so if people have an opportunity to take those steps to protect their safety, and then, have the community and the institutions support that. I think that is the measure of success.
Thank you. My next question, so in this first phase, the federal government did commit $1.3 million to support the pilot project. How do you think that governments, plural, can best support its implementation and ensure its long-term sustainability?
What has to happen, we're absolutely grateful to the federal government for providing the financial support to do this part of the work. But we can't always rely on the goodwill of government going forward, that we need to have. I was thinking of what the late Senator Marie Sinclair had said, that it took us 7 generations to get here and take us 7 generations to, create that change. And so we have to have a long-term commitment to the safety of Indigenous women and girls and gender diverse people. So that will require legislation, provincially and federally, I believe, that. But because of the urgent nature of this, Parliament had declared this a national emergency 2 years ago. And so we need to be able to act with precision on implementing an alert system.
One final question. In your opinion, what does culturally safe policing look like in practice for Indigenous women, girls, and gender diverse people?
Yeah.
Well, culturally, a culturally safe practice looks like, for an individual to be approached in a manner that's safe, that's where necessary, language have the appropriate language. It means moving beyond that initial interaction and providing that long-term support, including the families and communities. I can say that we had a situation in Winnipeg this summer where a young woman had remained unidentified for a year, and we partnered with police service and led the outreach to community publicly. And within 24 hours, the young woman was identified. Her family returned to Winnipeg, and so that was done. But without that community intervention, she would still be unidentified.
Thank you very much.
Suspend for a moment. I do believe we have Chief Bell online, so we would like to run a test, please, for the interpreters. And so I'll suspend just for a moment, please. And go ahead when you like.
Yes, good evening, everyone. My name is Chief Karen Bell of the Garden River First Nation in Ontario. I was a former police officer for 35 years in my home community of Garden River First Nation, employed with the Anishinaabeg Police Service. I have since resigned. I've resigned in March of this year. I am now the Chief of the Nation. And I'm open actually to a lot of conversation. I started my employment with the Anishinaabeg, well, actually with my First Nation in March of 1990. At that time that I started there, I had actually spent 3 years with the Toronto Police Service, went back to my home territory, was taken aback by the underfunding, the way in which policing was being conducted in that community. I was the first female officer to work in the community. I was also a lone officer working by myself in a very remote community with no backup other than an OPP member who may have been 40 to 100 miles away from me. And a lot of my interactions with the community were very sporadic and were very fractured because I did not have the support that mainstream police officers had, and I had come from a mainstream policing service, and I was not set or settled to be able to be a police officer working as a lone officer within a nation. And though I did carry a gun, yes, and I did have a baton, it still did not adequately support me having to do calls for service in a First Nation that had very traumatic incidences where I attended. That my personal safety was often at risk, especially coming from a service where I had, anywhere between 10 to 15 officers responding within a 2-minute window. A lot of times I did have to sit on the side of the highway or the side of a road and wait for half an hour plus in order for a backup to arrive. And so then I was leaving many members and member victims vulnerable because I was not responding in a timely fashion. Also, along that way, like I said, there is a provincial highway that goes through the community of Garden River First Nation. Currently, actually, there's 2 provincial highways that go through there, but at the time there was one, and it was the only highway. It was the Queen's Highway, and it intersects the eastern side of the country to the western side of the country, and anybody and everybody that travels from one side of the country to the other had to pass through my First Nation. And so I was making traffic stops on a highway in the dark by myself, and the only support that I had was the dispatcher, and that often, because I didn't feel safe, I would not make those stops, or I would not respond to calls until I had backup. And like I said, as a result, I was putting many people in a risk of vulnerability and further harm because I couldn't get to them at a time when was normally sufficient of a time when you have a number of officers to support you and provide you with that backup. And the fact that, I didn't have the officers to bounce things off of, not just for backup purposes, but on how to approach and deal with situations, especially in situations where there was in a crisis and there was decisions to be made on the fly, basically, right at the time that you're there. And even though I'm from that community, I know the people there. There are still often times where there's you don't know the people, or you don't know them when they're in a crisis, and they're receptive to do anything and everything. I have been chest bumped. I have been pushed from behind. I've had objects thrown at me in the dark and unable to identify who did them. I've entered homes or entered spaces where I was the only officer working and the only officer that had the ability to go there when the dispatcher's telling me my backup's not an hour away. I couldn't sit there and wait and listen to predominantly a female being assaulted, and I'm a police officer, and my role responsibility was to serve and protect the public and their property, and not do anything about it. So there were times that I did put myself in a situation where I probably shouldn't have. Nonetheless, that's the career that I spent in. That's how I had to deal with situations that I was presented to me, and I realized that at the end of the day, I had to go home. And there were times there, as an officer, you get those feelings that things are not comfortable or things are not safe for you, so you don't go there. And I would just like to let this committee know that the disparity in the backup system that we had at the time and still do, and the lack of funding that comes with additional vehicles, additional apparatus will augment your safety as an officer and provide that additional complement that will put two people in a cruiser rather than one. And to have to spend 12 nights, a 12-hour shift by yourself is not healthy for your own well-being. I can tell you back in the early 90s, because there was only 2 of us working, one of us would work all of day shifts, 12 hours in the day, and then the other officer would work every single night in the month on a night shift, and then we would flip over and do this is same on the next month, where I did 30 days shifts, 30 12-hour shifts in a row, and the other officer would do 30 days of 12-hour night shifts in a row, and then we would switch, and we never have any time off because there was nobody else to serve and protect the community, and it was not the responsibility of the OPP to police that community, and we had no choice but to work those kinds of hours and those kinds of days. As an officer early on in my career in the 1990s, and on top of that, oftentimes when you were working a night shift, you had to go to court the next morning. So you were in court all day, and then you would come home and get maybe 2 or 3 hours of sleep, and you would get up and go back to work again. So it does drain a lot of people. It does wear and tear on the human body because every working day, you're in a uniform. Every working hour, it seems like you're in a uniform, and you've dedicated your entire life and your entire career to working in that community. And if I did not have a vested interest in my home community and the public safety, I probably would not have lasted 35 years for sure. I would have went probably back to another police service where I knew that coming from the Toronto Police Service, I knew that I didn't have to work the hours that I was working, and that I would have the support from many other officers, as well as technological items that I could use to support it. We had nobody officer. I was the only officer. I was the chief cook and bottle washer. I was the officer that did all the calls for service.
Bell,
I was
sorry for interrupting, but thank you very much for your opening statement.
Okay, good enough.
We'll get some more questions going and some more time for you to answer questions from the members. We're going to go to resume the order. We're going to go to MP Schmale and then followed by Deputy Lemire. Okay.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to both our witnesses for your testimony here today. Chief Bell, maybe I'll start with you if you don't mind. Thank you for your service to all the police services you served. I can imagine just based on your short testimony here, I can imagine you have a large amount of stories left untold. Having said that, just based on your testimony alone, it sounded like you were just racing from call to call. It sounded like the time that you would spend with somebody, would they be in crisis or otherwise, because of the constraints put on the service, because of the program, the funding, et it was almost like a Band-Aid situation. You really didn't have the time to complete many investigations. I'm sure you did, but it seemed like there were some that you probably wished you had more time with an individual to help them through their crisis.
Yes, you're correct in understanding that. And now, I worked for a very large police service, Toronto Police Service, and then I went to my home community, and the calls for service are not as voluminous as I had come from, but nonetheless, there are calls, and these people that live in those communities expect the cops to arrive when they call for service. And if the police are not showing up, then those people in that community are certainly letting their chief and council know that, first of all, where are our police? And if we're getting support and policing from through funding and through support of the Ontario Provincial Police, then why is our members not here? So you're absolutely right. I did not have even time to think about long and hard about what I was doing. It was just you were going from crisis to crisis, and I had learned very early on that this is the way policing is done or expected in these small community, and I just lived with it. I had no choice.
Yeah, I can imagine even just hearing your testimony where you're saying you're on the side of the road waiting for backup to show up because the situation seemed potentially dangerous and something I don't blame you for jumping into until backup and that was handled properly. Given the fact that this program has been created in the 90s or was created in the 90s, and the fact that There have been a couple of kind of reviews of the program along the way, but nothing substantial to the point where there were really major changes to the program. And of course, the Prime Minister at the time, Trudeau, promised Indigenous policing was going to be an essential service. I think that was 2019, 2020 when that happened. We've seen really nothing progress in that front, and to the point where nothing was introduced in the budget just a few weeks ago that showed an intention to enhance this program.
Yes, you're correct there again. This program started before I became a police officer in 1990. There were two other officers there when I arrived. And I realized why the program started and what it was designed for, because the OPP, well, first of all, it was the RCMP that policed First Nations across the country, and then eventually the OPP took over the policing of the First Nations under that program. And then they quickly realized that they were having difficulty attending calls and doing calls for service because of the historical wrongdoings or misconceptions that Indigenous people had with police. And so then they then instituted the Indian Policing Program and hired the Indigenous police officers, predominantly from their home communities, to police their people. And then it got to a space where we weren't sufficient for the number of calls that we were getting. If you're going to a court and you're sitting in court all day long, you would expect to go home and have a rest for 6 to 8 hours and go back to work. Well, that did not happen for us.
Okay, thank you, Chief Bell. Maybe I'll how much time do I have, Chair?
You have a minute and a bit.
Okay, maybe to Ms. Delarond here. You had mentioned in your words here about making sure, and by the way, we support the Red Just Alert system on this side of the House. I think all parties do. I'm pretty sure that received unanimous support. So thank you for everything you've done on that and the work of you and your colleagues. You had talked about ensuring that the women and girls are safe. Are you noticing, first of all, an increase in violent crime that's kind of across the country in many communities, but also the fact that it seems to be like we're not talking about an 18-year-old who made a mistake that got arrested. We're talking about those that offend, get arrested, out on bail, offend, just this revolving door justice system that we've been encountering lately. Is that posing a problem in the conversations you're having on the ground?
Yes, because, I mean, I'm giving you my First Nation policing perspective as a police officer, and then I'm also now the chief of a nation. So I'm giving you two perspectives, and I can tell you that the women are victims at all fronts. There is a definite increase in violent crime. There's a definite increase in human trafficking, a definite increase in drugs in the communities, and all the communities, not just mine. And so that means that even though all of these things have come in, and when people, mostly men, and offend and get released, they don't go anywhere else other back to their home. And so now we're back in the same square one, and recidivism just keeps repeating itself.
Thank you very much. And Deputy Lemire, pour 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Mr. Lemire.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to both our witnesses. And thank you for all your experience that you have with the most vulnerable in our population, especially women and girls. And Chief Bell, I'd like to congratulate you on being the first female chief of Garden River First Nation. Now, given your extensive experience and given your current role as chief, could you share with the committee the main changes you've seen over the years within your community in terms of public safety? Today, what do you think the most urgent priority should be when it comes to federal legislation for policing in First Nations? What do you think needs to be done to ensure the safety and well-being of the people in your community?
Yes, thank you. For the first comment that I would say is that I feel that First Nations should be considered be designated as an essential service, because without that designation, we're not going to get additional financial support for all of the other outlying services that other police services have, other than we'll stay in the same boat for the last 35 years and be one or two or three officers trying to do everything.
Le comité entend.
The committee has been hearing more and more often that criminal gangs target First Nations, knowing that there are fewer police services in these communities when it comes to equipment and funding. Now, in the case of Garden River and the territory served by the Anishinaabe Police Services, have you seen any attempts on the part of criminal gangs trying to exploit this vulnerability within the First Nations? And how does that affect the ability of your own police services to protect your community, rather?
We are not untouchable, that we are also another nation that sits here like a sitting duck, waiting for these persons of criminality to come. They are an enterprise that they see money, and the easy way to get into this money is by targeting vulnerable persons in Ontario. And the vulnerable persons are these communities that are left without proper policing and effective other services that other police services have, like a drug unit, like a dog handler, like detectives, like analysis on crime. We just don't have those kinds of things. And you're looking at a very, very vulnerable population of men and women who are sitting there and allowing these things. They're not allowing it, but it comes in, and it is affecting everybody. And I can say, as the chief of the nation, when the Robinson-Huron Treaty Settlement Agreement of $10 billion came into the 21 nations within the treaty area, we definitely identified as chiefs that there was a high influx of non-desirable people coming into our communities. And as a result, now we're left on how we're going to try and eliminate this or get rid of this kind of behavior. And we're stuck trying to create bylaws that don't have any teeth to them.
Votre service de police.
Your police services serve 16 different communities. In my area, we have a similar project to serve several Indigenous communities. What are the advantages of grouping communities like this, especially given your previous answer? And what would the challenges be, and how would you deal with the differing realities within each communities? So if you're going to share resources, what does that do to the resources themselves? Can you speak to that?
Yes, I did come from the Anishinaabe Police Service, where there are 17 detachments. And when there was a special event or a crisis happening in one of the communities, as the supervisor, I would reach out to the other supervisors in the community and say, I need supports, which means that those officers would leave their home communities and come and help and assist another community. But in the meantime, now we've left another community vulnerable because the officers have gone, and they're now traveled, say, from Southern Ontario to Northern Ontario to assist another First Nation in their policing situation. And this is not helping. It is not there. We talk about band-aiding, and this is what we are doing. We're just rotating officers around to different First Nations to provide additional support. But we now left those communities who get, as their chiefs and councils, they get very frustrated because we've just asked to borrow 3 of their officers for a week to 2 weeks to a month, plus who knows how long, and we don't have those additional supports like other services do.
Votre communauté.
Your community is in a region where there are several different police organizations. So how do you all coordinate the provision of those services at the provincial and First Nations level when it comes to investigations, when it comes to urgent responses, etc.?
I can tell you that when I started my policing career in 1990, There was an invisible line between police services. I was stuck in the bush on a First Nation working as a police officer, and I had no access to a municipality police. I didn't even know who they were. I would once in a while hear from an OPP member if he decided to drive through the highway to get to his other area of responsibility. There was little to no cohesiveness, and it took me almost my entire career to create that bond and relationship with other services, and it now has definitely got much, much better from when I first started, and we can rely on members of either the Sault Ste. Marie City Police or the Ontario Provincial Police to come and provide all those supports. Plus, we have a memorandum of understanding with the Ontario Provincial Police that if we cannot provide support such as a drug unit or dog handlers or major crime investigators, that they will provide those supports for us.
Merci beaucoup. Questions for the two presenters, and first off we have the Conservatives, MP Stevenson on the list. You're going to go? Okay. MP Zimmer, please. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you both to our witnesses. And my question is for Karen, and I appreciate, first of all, thank you for your service, as my colleague just said previous. And you continued your service after serving many years in the police force as being a community leader in chief. You know, it just continues, and I appreciate your care for your community. As a question to you, though, you served in the Toronto Police Force, you said, for 3 years. And how many years did you serve in community?
I actually started as a correctional officer in Ottawa. From there, I went to Toronto Police for 3 years, and then from there, I went to my home community, and I spent 35 years in my home community policing.
Yeah, again, that's amazing. And just to reiterate what you said, or repeat what you said at times your personal safety was at risk. You had to wait for a half an hour at times for backup on the side of the road before, and which impeded sort of your helping people that you wanted to help. And you also said there was a lack of funding. And in the report that the Parliamentary Budgetary Report on First Nations and Inuit Police Funding, page 1, it says, most stakeholders believe self-administered First Nations and Inuit police services are underfunded. Would you agree?
Yes.
My second question, and maybe I'll ask you this first because I almost assume you do. Do you hunt?
Yes.
You do. I'm assuming you own hunting rifles.
Yes.
You might know then already the planned gun confiscation plan by the government. They're at about $800 million now. Estimates are in the billions and as high as $6 billion. I've seen an expert estimate that at. Would you rather spend that kind of money on hiring more officers and having better resources to police community, or would you rather spend that money attacking law-abiding firearms owners?
I would definitely take the money.
Where would you focus that? Would you have it in officers and I guess in equipment? I guess if you could plan it out and you had the access to the resources, where would you spend it?
If I could have a wish list and I said I had that kind of money, the first thing I would do is increase the complement. I worked for far too long in that First Nation without support and know what it does on a person's mental health. And you lose a lot of things because of that. And I would definitely take the money and say, first of all, complement. And of course, from complement becomes, the resources and the technical supports that come with having additional police officers working in a nation.
And so it looks like you still lack sufficient officers. It started, like if you've been at it for 35 years, you said it was a problem 35 years ago. And even you just mentioned that example where you're sort of robbing Peter to pay Paul with officers and you're sharing them around. Meanwhile, those communities aren't adequately policed. And we've heard that from many witnesses too. that from chiefs of police, of Inuit and First Nations police forces across Canada, we've heard that same issue. On the issue around gun confiscation, and I'm sure you've seen both sides of this issue, I guess 3 sides of it, as being a community leader, police officer, and then a hunter yourself. If you're asked to confiscate and use resources of your police service to go confiscate firearms from First Nations hunters, what's your plan to do what the government wants you to do?
Well, I can tell you that as a chief of the nation currently, that is not my priority. I don't see, and spending 35 years policing that community, knowing lots, knowing people who are in the community, and the calls that I've dealt with in 35 years, the guns are not the priority. What's the priority is our vulnerable people, our vulnerable women and children, our people that are getting human trafficked, all kinds of assaults that go with it. That's what's important. That's what we got to tackle, not guns.
Right. Yeah, and I guess I maybe ask you one last question. How much time, Chair?
Sorry, you're out of time.
Okay, well, thank you, Karen, for your testimony.
Thank you. Next on the list is Parliamentary Secretary Jaime.
I'm going to start off with Sandra and just ask you some questions, and thank you for your testimony. We've heard a lot of discussion around the lack of Indigenous police, the lack of First Nations police, but we really haven't heard a lot of discussion about how we can encourage and increase Indigenous women to be a part of the police force. And I'm wondering if you have any perspectives that you could share on how we can ensure that we have more Indigenous women who are part of the police services, both in the RCMP or in the areas that are policed by Winnipeg Police. I don't know what the policing is in your neck of the woods, but if you could talk a little bit about that, that would be great.
Thank you for your question. I have some experience with being on the Commanding Officers Advisory Committee for the RCMP in Manitoba for several years. And recruiting is critical. Who's recruiting is critical. But I also think that there really needs to be an support, cultural support, within all the police forces. But particularly when it comes to women, we know that there have been some cases before the courts or the tribunals on the treatment of Indigenous women, Indigenous officers within police forces. So when we talk about cultural competency, we have to address that internalized racism and discrimination within the police forces.
You said something there that I think was key, and you said who is recruiting is critical. And we've heard testimony that, many people are applying to the RCMP or Indigenous police programs, but they're weeded out somehow within. Do you think that it's important for Indigenous women to be doing the recruiting, doing the questioning, because you have a unique experience in Canada that's absolutely clear from the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women's Inquiry? Is this something that we really need to focus on as a recommendation?
I think that's critical in my experience and from the stories that we've heard over the years, that when you have an Indigenous woman in leadership, whether that's police leadership or community leadership, things change for the benefit of the community or those that we serve. It's like yesterday, one of our Inuit relatives, Nikki Kamitsatutsak, talked about historically how the women had to, listen to what was happening on the land and apply those in order to preserve and enhance their family life. And I think that having women in policing, they bring that inherent knowledge to listen and to apply that in terms of providing safety measures for community. And, when people that come in before the law see Indigenous women in these positions, there's an automatic feeling of safety and an automatic feeling that they're going to be okay.
So Chief Bell, same question around, do we need more Indigenous women doing the recruiting, doing the interviewing, and how do we promote Indigenous women in the police force?
Yes, it's a very difficult position to have on a First Nation or an area where a large number of Indigenous people reside. Women are not typically looked as the enforcer, the layer of the law, the arresting person. I can tell you that in the years that I've been a police officer, I've never had another female officer hired in my community, a female officer, and it's slowly changing, yes. We're still very, very outnumbered, and the only way I see that is, like you say, having that female recruiter, having that voice that's going to be in front of individuals, attending those public schools, attending high schools, post-secondary, really encouraging women that this is a good career to have. You're still doing, you're still doing a lot for your community. Yes, you have to sacrifice things because you have to work shift work, but nonetheless, I still think that there is a role, and a greater role as we pass along in our years here, that women are now at a point where they should be sitting in spaces and places of typical roles that were not identified as females to work in those locations.
Thank you.
Deputy Lemire for 2.5 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. de la Ronde, you're at the head of a network, and based on your experience, I'd like to speak to you about the Red Alert system. When this was set up, what were the key factors that made that Red Alert system effective in alerting you to the disappearance of the women and girls? And what would we need to do to make that work elsewhere in Canada, in rural regions, in Quebec and elsewhere?
Not sure if I got the interpretation right, but we don't have an alert system yet. We've issued our report to put in place a red dress alert system. And, based on our community interventions, we need an alert system now.
Et quelles sont les lacunes?
In that case, what is lacking? If we could act, if you had more resources, whether it be technical or financial, how could the federal government play a role?
I think that the federal government can play a role by enacting legislation to implement a nationwide red dress alert system. We do have a national crisis into missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and gender diverse people. So that would be the first thing: the legislation, the development of partnerships to ensure that that there is collaboration to create a safer environment for all of our relatives.
Le manque de données sur les femmes.
There is a lack of data on Indigenous women and girls who have disappeared, and that's a major obstacle. We know that those first few hours are critical. It's important to be able to find these women as quickly as possible. So how could there be more shared openness to sharing this kind of data? And how would we do that?
In Manitoba, our organization, Gaganawe Mananig, has developed a database called Red Dress Stories MB.ca, where we have been able to, rely on different databases, media reports, and family notifications of our missing and murdered loved ones. So I can tell you that from 2010 to 2020, in 10 years, we've had 105 women and girls and gender diverse people go missing in Manitoba. But from 2020 to August of this year, we've also had 105 people be murdered in our small little province.
Merci.
Merci.
Thank you.
MP Stevenson, please.
Thank you. I go to Chief Bell again. Thank you for your service. You've given some testimony that I've already had some of my questions, but can you tell me the population of your community?
Yes, my community has a population close to 4,000, but only actually about 1,200 living on the nation.
And what kind of territory? What area would you say that is? How big of area is that?
We're on the border, the U.S. border, in between the Great Lakes. We have an area just east of the city of Sault Ste. Marie. The area consists of, if you were looking at it size-wise, it'd be 10 by 10 by 10.
So when where I'm going with this is just, you've said you've had improvements, and I'm just wondering how many officers do you actually have now in your community?
When I started in 1990, we had 3, and then in 1995, we ended up with 2 more. And so from 1995 to 2025, we still have the same number, 5.
I would imagine your population has increased over that time.
Yes.
So, okay. So if you had the magic wand, and I'm assuming you've actually had conversations with your neighbors, neighboring areas too. Do you have an idea, if you guys come up with what would be an ideal amount of officers per area? I know in my in my riding in Yellowhead, all of my areas are policed by RCMP, and I know that they are often 400 to 600 to 700 or 800 square kilometers per officer that they have to do it, but which is is way too much for an individual officer. So I'm just wondering if you come up to worked out what is an optimal formula to get to a number of how many police officers you really should have?
Well, I would say it would have to be double right off the top, because if you have officers working night shifts, then who's going to work days? If you have officers on training, who's going to work their shifts? Or if you have officers on sick leave, who's going to work their shifts? We have to have that kind of a number to support and augment 365 days of policing.
Thank you. I don't have too much time here, but I'll maybe ask Ms. Dilleron. When like I say, I'm from Alberta, and my riding doesn't have the issues that some other ones do for remote, even though it's huge riding. I have heard of some of the ridings in Saskatchewan and possibly Manitoba where they have rural areas are getting fly-in officers. Have they really looked at much of that? Do you know of, to make some of the coverage to get some of their policing dealt with in that way?
So in Manitoba, the RCMP still has fly-in communities. Many of our communities are fly-in. So
the actual coverage for the officers, where they were having officers that might be located, say they live in Winnipeg, but then they fly for a week or 2 weeks up into the whatever areas that they might be policing.
yeah, that's one of the strategies that's in place in Manitoba.
And do you know how, what is the percentage, or do you know what kind of coverage is that a kind of a minority, or is it becoming more of a issue that they deal with? Because a lot of those guys are not necessarily connected to communities like you were discussing before to have that community-based person there that's understanding everything.
Well, limited posting has been an issue that was raised in the national inquiry, and having non community members or Indigenous officers policing those communities, continues to create barriers. If you had Indigenous persons or officers policing those communities, there is, I think, less animosity.
Connected to the community, they have better effects there.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And before we conclude, I'm just going to exercise the chair's prerogative to ask a question in the last Liberal spot. So my question is around human trafficking, and I'm going to, pose the question to Chief Bell, because obviously I'm very familiar with the area and where Garden River is situated. It's one of the narrowest spots in the river. And, you already mentioned that you are a border nation to the United States. Will, and there is some money in the budget talking about doing more enforcement along the border. How important is that as it relates to Garden River and its safety? Because I've been down the river, I've been with the APS, I've been with the CBSA, and they always talk about that spot in Garden River that is very, very narrow, and they'll point and they point to the bridge that connects Sault Ste. Marie, and they'll say only the dumb criminals take that one. So there's a lot of pressure on your community, not only being on the highway, but also being so close to the United States. So some comments on that, please, Chief Bell.
Yes, I'll put it into some sort of a context. And I was a member of the Anishinaabeg Police Service, and in 2001, from 2001 to 2004, I had the fortunate ability to join what was called, it was an initiative, I do believe, by the RCMP, and they had what they called Border Enforcement Team, an International Border Enforcement Team, and that consisted of several police services, both the U.S. and Canada. We did a lot of border protection because Canada is so vulnerable, and they realized very quickly that a lot of the First Nations in Canada are bordering the U.S., and that is the vulnerable locations. So I had 4 years of experience working with the RCMP on this integrated border enforcement team, and most, if not all, of the interdictions we had with vulnerable persons and people who are trying to attempt to enter into the U.S. or vice versa all took place at that little location that you've kind of alluded to, where you can just throw a baseball and you'd be in the U.S. And there were people making every means of effort to get over there illegally, whether it be by boat or pontoon or a flotation device or swimming, but that is the prime location where all of the trafficking of persons back and forth took place. And you leave that alone and put it aside and think about, well, who's going to police that when this IBET team disintegrates, which did in 2004. And so now that spot is still there and is still vulnerable and not being adequately policed.
So you would recommend something similar to, just this is for the people taking note, the analysts, you would recommend something similar to what was done in the past with some improvements then?
Yes, absolutely. At that time that I was on that integrated border enforcement team, we had weekly conversations with a lot of the law enforcement on the Canadian side and the U.S. side. We did joint projects together. I spent a lot of time in the U.S. That faces Canada and predominantly my nation, because I knew the people in my nation, and they knew that was a vulnerable location. That was where people were getting trafficked back and forth. And so the public gets to know that too. And we were interdicting people from all over Canada that knew that was a vulnerable location to do. So to increase and to keep that relationship going is very, very important, especially in this time of what's going on in the country.
Well, thank you very much, Chief Bell, and thank you for your testimony and answers, and as well, Sandra De Laurent, thank you very much for your work as well. So, Chimigwich, everyone, we are going to suspend and get ready for our next panel. So,
Miigwech.
we're back. Okay, and today in the second panel, we have the Office of the Parliamentary Budget Officer, Jason Jacques, Interim Parliamentary Budget Officer. Welcome. And Govindad Eva, not bad, Bernier, Director Budget Analysis. You will have 5 minutes. Please, gentlemen, begin.
Bon, Monsieur le Président, membre du comité, nous...
Mr. Chair, Vice Chairs, and members of the committee, thank you for the invitation to appear before you today. We are pleased to be here to present the findings of our report entitled Overview of First Nations and Inuit Police Funding and Spending, which we were honored to prepare at the request of this committee.
Comme vous le savez,
as you know, Indigenous policing is a complex and sensitive topic. An adequate comparative analysis of costs to provide policing in First Nations and Inuit communities needs to consider multiple factors. Given the significant amount of time it took to determine the availability and obtain data from Public Safety Canada. We were unable to provide a comparative analysis of Indigenous versus non-Indigenous policing. Instead, this report examines funding and expenditure trends for the First Nations and Inuit Policing Program and the First Nations and Inuit Policing Facilities Program, as well as for self-administered First Nations and Inuit police services.
And 2025, planned and actual federal funding for First Nations and Inuit policing through the First Nations and Inuit Policing Program and the First Nations and Inuit Policing Facilities Program tripled. Notwithstanding this funding increase, and based on our analysis, we bring to the committee two conclusions. The uncertainty with program funding leads to short-term contribution agreements. This disrupts long-term planning for the communities that actually need to deliver policing services. Second, the funding gap for First Nations and Inuit policing must be estimated. Should the committee wish, we would be very eager to undertake this analysis. Nous répondrons avec plaisir.
We would be pleased to respond to any questions you may have regarding this report. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Merci.
Thank you.
To the first round, and for the Conservatives, MP Zimmer, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks again, Jason, for coming before committee. I appreciate your work. I'll turn to page 1 of your report on the overview of First Nations and Inuit police funding and spending. Quote, most stakeholders believe self-administered First Nations and Inuit police services are underfunded, and there is a need for federal legislation that recognizes First Nations policing as an essential service. While the federal government previously committed to table such legislation, the Minister of Public Safety wants to secure funding prior to its introduction. The cost of funding resulting from such legislation is currently not known, and that's from your report. And it essentially says that the government's not spending enough on community policing, and I know there's issues with even getting some of the money to community, even that some of the money that's on the table, it's difficult to get it spent. But I guess the puzzling part for me is, but the government seems to have the money to confiscate law-abiding First Nations and Inuit firearms owners' firearms. And as your office stated before, and I'll quote an article from 2024, quote, the Parliamentary Budget Officer estimates ranged between 150,000 to more than 500,000, with an estimated total value between $47 million and $756 million. And the article goes on, these costs only include the value of the confiscated firearms and exclude the administrative costs to collect them and the cost of destroying the collected firearms. And this is the doozy. The total cost of this ban to taxpayers will be more than $4 billion and possibly more than $6 billion. And that's not from you, this is from this other source that extrapolates the numbers. So seeing that most stakeholders of the quote I just read believe First Nations and Inuit policing is underfunded and under-resourced, do you think it's a good use of taxpayer dollars to spend potentially billions of dollars to go after highly vetted, law-abiding citizens and their hunting rifles? Or would it be better if the government spent that money to go after criminals?
Mm-hmm. It's not the mandate of the Parliamentary Budget Office to opine upon government policy. What I would say is similar to the Government of Canada's gun buyback program, where we received a request from a committee to put a number, a cost estimate, on something where the government did not have a cost estimate. This seems to be a similar situation where there seems to be a broad qualitative consensus that there is underfunding for these services, and there seems to be no official number available to anyone. And as a starting point to come up with an estimate of how much additional money may be required, I think it behooves somebody potentially, it's certainly within our mandate. Other people could do it, but simply putting a number around it is a good starting point to support parliamentarians in having a very healthy policy debate.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I'll move on to my second question, Jason. From page 3 of your report, and this is on the budget. So this is Budget 2025 Issues for Parliamentarians. And I'll go to page 3 where it talks about budgetary balance. The Prime Minister will add 320, if you add up that bottom line on page 3, it's 78.3 billion this year, 65.4 billion next year, 63.5 billion 2027, 2028, 57.9 billion in 28, 29, and 56 more in 29 and 2030. The total of that debt added to our national debt will be $321.7 billion. That's over the next 5 years, of course. And that's more than twice the $154 billion of the previous Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. And this Prime Minister promised he would spend less and invest more. And it looks like he's spending a whole lot more by my estimations and by your document. Does this massive increase in government spending and debt concern you?
Mr. Chair, I'll just circle back through you with respect to whether the committee would like me to answer the question, because while I'm very happy to answer questions about our analysis, and I definitely have an answer, it does seem slightly outside of the purview of the reason why we were asked to come and testify before the committee today.
You are correct. You are correct. So,
Yeah, feel free to.
No. I mean, stick to what we're supposed to be doing here. I think I heard some over here.
The right thing.
Yeah.
I asked the question. I'd appreciate it. It is your report.
Point of order.
Yeah, so I would appreciate an answer to the question.
So we have to stick to the context, and even the witnesses have identified that they feel that this is out of order. So I would appreciate.
Bob's time.
I'll give him his time back, but point of order, we brought him here to talk about Indigenous policing. He did a great CTV interview that I think answers the question that you're posing, that you can watch, and I think that it addresses that. So
I wish
We'll give you your time, but please another question, because even the witness had identified that they didn't feel that it was appropriate. So.
Yeah. So I guess even talking about Indigenous policing and Inuit policing, I guess considering that the budget has massively grown, and there's other requirements and other requests for those funds to be spent on policing, does he think the money spent on other things other than policing is overly excessive? The $321 billion is overly excessive.
I think going back to the comments with the text and the observations we made in our Budget 2025 issues note, it is a very challenging economic and fiscal situation. And certainly when you have a situation like this where there is a consensus that there seems to be a qualitative consensus that there is underfunding for these essential services across the country, and a very important essential service, having clarity around what the appropriate funding level is and actually putting a number around it could certainly help parliamentarians navigate what are very challenging trade-offs right now in the fiscal environment.
Good, thank you.
Yeah.
Now we go to P.S. Hanley for 6 minutes.
Yeah, I'm good to go. Thank you. Thank you very much for your rapid analysis and also for being here today. Really appreciate it. I have a few questions just to maybe get a better sense of the work that you've done and some of the conclusions that you've drawn. The first, you obviously point out a discrepancy between funding and spending, essentially, and then you point out a kind of an asynchrony between one of the reasons being an asynchrony between budgetary fiscal schedules, fiscal cycles between the provinces and the territories, and the federal. And so I wonder if you can maybe elaborate a little bit on that and other reasons behind that discrepancy between planned and planned and actual spending and what lies behind that. Particularly, I guess I would want not to get the federal spending off the hook, but to understand more of the impact of the provincial and territorial funding being out of sync or insufficient.
Thank you for the question. So as you probably know, the First Nation and Inuit Policing Program, the FNIPP, same for the Facilities Program as well, is a cost-shared program. So the federal government spends 52%, provincial government spend 48%. And so one of the conditions for the federal government to actually put the money on the table is that the province or territory is going to also provide the 48% remaining. And so one thing that we heard from public safety officials, and it's also in their departmental results report, is that, for example, when increased funding was announced in Budget 2021, it took the provinces by surprise a bit. So they have the federal government has this new money that's available. They want to provide it to the First Nation police services, but then provinces might have already tabled their own budget. Sorry for the interpreter. They might be in the middle of their planning cycle, so they might need to wait till the next year until they can actually match that funding. So that was one of the reasons that was explained why there was often discrepancies. And I guess a more recent example, we don't mention it in the report, but Budget 2024 also announced additional funding for the FNIPP and the FNIPFP. And when the departmental plan was tabled, the public safety departmental plan in June 2025, that additional funding was still not in the 3 years plan, and it's only in the supplementary estimates B that have been tabled 2 weeks ago that are going to be voted on before December 10, that there was actual additional money that was appropriated or right now is being asked to be appropriated. So there seems to be also a lag in terms of planning.
And maybe you've answered it in general, but I noticed more specifically in Figure 1 that the gap is substantially higher in, I think, 23-24 compared to the 24-25, almost like there's a recovery in a way of that discrepancy. So is there a particular reason for that year being?
I can't tell you if there's a particular reason for that. Potentially provinces and territories caught up at some point and were able to secure their own share of the funding, but I really have no idea specifically.
And so I guess that would be, were you to undertake further, deeper analysis, I suppose those kinds of questions could be answered.
We could answer that, although that would not be necessarily the same thing as estimating the funding gap that is necessary right now to address the service levels that would probably be needed in those First Nation police services.
Understood. Okay.
But yes, it's definitely something, the type of analysis that we could do if requested to do so.
Mr. Jacques, did you want to add something to
that? I was only going to add, I think this is the 8th report that our office has done over the past 17 years with respect to funding gaps between essential services, whether it's on the education, healthcare side, capital, operating, First Nations water and wastewater. And I've certainly, our office has certainly seen charts like this in the past, and this chart, what jumps out, and again, Govinda is correct, we don't have a definitive answer, and having seen it 8 times in the past, what typically is happening is the absorptive capacity of the 634 First Nations across the country to absorb a significant jump in funding immediately is relatively limited. It's not that the money cannot be used or should not be used, it's simply that when governments come to the table and say, congratulations, we're substantially increasing the funding next year, everyone's happy, and then the real work has to start, which is the work of actually taking the money and putting it into practice.
Which I'll just briefly say, which kind of I guess solidifies your one of your 2 conclusions about the effect of longer-term stable funding would obviously mitigate against that phenomenon of undercapacity with short-term funding.
Very, very much so. It's been a recurring, typically when we've looked at federal funding for various First Nations programs in the past, there end up being two parts or two issues that we focused on or that become evident. The first is the governance issue. Well, the first is the funding issue. The second is the governance issue. And the governance issue really comes back to the side of the federal government wanting to do something, federal, provincial governments wanting to put in additional funding and not being able to necessarily provide the guidance that the guidance or the guarantee that First Nations would expect, in the same way that, I don't know, for the city of Quebec, they can provide guidance to their police force from 1 year to the next and multiple years going out, how much money is going to be there and what type of support will be available. Whereas in the case of Garden River First Nation, you have the provincial government, you have the federal government, you have the realities on the ground that you're dealing with. Potentially you're dealing with multiple different departments. So you're dealing with multiple agreements, and it gets really complex really quickly, and especially with differing schedules for election campaigns. But that, again, that's something, it's a common theme that comes up over and over again.
Merci. Deputy Lemire.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lemire. You have 6 minutes. Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Jacques and Mr. Bernier. Thank you for your work and the impact that it has on our own work. In your opening statement, you spoke about the importance of cost analysis so that we could meet the needs of policing in First Nations. Now, I think that it would be important to make a recommendation in our report. So what do you think would be the best benchmarks we could suggest for a study on this? Well, we think something like this should be a priority for your committee. And the data exists. The data exists within the Government of Canada, within Statistics Canada. And there are already some graphics that exist. There's data within the RCMP. So the service quality has to be analyzed, has to be looked at. And with this type of analysis, the methodology is actually quite simple. What's complex is convincing people to share their data, because the methodology exists. You know, Excel spreadsheets exist. You know, we could ask them, just buy some pizza and Coca-Cola for Govinda. Let him work on this for a week, or after 8 weeks, 2 months, he'd have your results ready. Well, I'm going to ask you a question that I think is also complex. In your report, you talk about these provincial and federal funding cycles that are out of sync with each other, as well as all the police services in different First Nations. So do you think this misalignment is one of the causes of the underfunding we see in the programs, or is it rather the symptom of jurisdictional ambiguity between the various levels of government? And what structural changes would need to be made to reduce that friction? Because this cost sharing agreement also is an issue, the 52% versus the 48%.
Je pense pas qu'on ait nécessairement de recommandations.
Well, I don't know that we would necessarily have any recommendations, but I think what would be important to note is that in all these cost-sharing agreements, there's a list of criteria that determines what will determine the level of funding available. So, for example, the geographic location. Is this an isolated community? How big is the population? What's the crime rate? What's the serious crime rate? So there are many different statistics that are taken into consideration. But ultimately, there has to be federal funding and provincial funding. And so I think the will is there to provide the funding, to provide these services. However, if the federal government doesn't have enough funding, or if the provinces or territories don't have enough matching funding, for example, then you end up in a dead end in a way. But overall, we gave an example of one Indigenous service in Ontario, the Anishinaabe Police Service, and they voluntarily joined Ontario legislation. So they have this kind of framework, analysis framework, that is necessary in order to be able to determine what services can fall under that legislation. And, you know, if there was a number of officers that needed to be doubled, for example, and when that happens, the province has to turn towards the federal government. They need to ask for a request as well. They need to ask for a 52% of that funding. But we need the right analysis. We need the right method. Probably not all police services need to double in number, but it shows what the limits of the system are currently. But concretely, if Ontario wants to, say, put $98, for example, does that mean that the federal government will only give the 42? How does that work? Does it give the money anyway? Well, say $98 would not necessarily be provided through the First Nations or to the First Nations. There's a very strict breakdown, 52% and 48%. However, there are other provincial initiatives and other federal initiatives that exist. There's another fund, for example, to combat serious crime. And this is provided to various police services, not just the First Nation police services. So they get funding sometimes through other channels. And provinces probably also have other channels if they absolutely want to be able to provide direct funding. But anything that goes through this specific arrangement has to respect that 52%, 48% breakdown. In your report, you said that when you asked for electronic data in a workbook format, you were told that it wasn't available. Now, in 2024, the Minister of Public Safety told us that they weren't able to maintain an IT system that would allow them to provide data in a specific format, and he said he was looking for a way to find the money in order to be able to invest that into their IT. But he said it's a department-wide IT. How is it that in 2025, public safety cannot be able to provide that information that we need for police servicing in First Nations and Inuit communities throughout the country? Well, we're not really supposed to interpret what happens, but I'll just give you some context. All the information was submitted. However, it was almost as if we'd been given a pile of papers. There were columns and columns of numbers and tons of pages. And in order to analyze them, we had to enter that manually into a computer. And that's the problem. I don't necessarily want to defend them. Perhaps over the course of 1 year, they didn't have enough time to improve their IT system. But it's not our role to voice an opinion on this. Thank you. Thank you. I'm pleased with your answer.
MP Stevenson for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. I think Deputy Lemire was looking over my notes and took some of my questions. I had a bunch of them. They're exactly the same. But I'll ask him maybe a couple of them in some different ways. I don't think you were here when Chief Bell was here at the end, but I did ask her specifically if she could come up with, if she had a number to say what is the optimum number to have for officers per area, per population, and that sort of thing. I know, going with some of this data that you have, my closest town to where I live is at that population where they actually have to have their own police station now. So and all of my areas are RCMP. And they know they've got the numbers of, if you have so much for a town, here's your number that they say should be your RCMP number. And each RCMP costs X dollars. So when I'm looking at some of these, they're pretty general, saying that they're underfunded. And you said that you'd be willing to look at certain, take on a study. I'm just wondering whether or not the information that you would have, or you'd have to study it, or whether or not you think you have the information to actually be able to say, quantify these. Being a CPA, I kind of like to have the numbers and the costs to figure out this. But when we're looking at this, do you think there's the numbers there available to figure out what that actual amount is, instead of just saying it's underfunded, to actually say how many officers they actually need, how many, and because we can figure out that number, the dollar value, if we can figure out how many numbers they are, to come up with the optimum number of officers per area, and whether or not I think it's going to be different for certain rural areas versus the some of the band areas, some of their reserves. They will have a different number than it would be for in the cities. But would you be able to say you have those numbers available if you did the study?
The data certainly exist. So I was speaking to one of the other members of the committee just immediately before the proceedings started, and I mentioned that I had the privilege of being on interchange 2 years ago and working with Kevin Page at the University of Ottawa. And I worked on several First Nations contracts where we specifically undertook support to identify these types of funding gaps. So I have quite a bit of confidence that the data exist. And being a CPA as well, I have quite a bit of confidence that there are methodologies that either exist from the RCMP or from the OPP or from the QPP or other police forces that offer these services across the country. And looking at it can certainly be done. And we could certainly offer you scenarios. And again, it's something where, I don't know, being a CPA myself, it's great that everyone qualitatively says it's underfunded. Why don't we just put a number on the table?
That's exactly where
and then
I
people
would like
can
to see
have a qualitative debate, but this is a knowable fact at this point.
Okay. For the most part, I think that's going to cover what I have. I think I'll let go from
Thank
there.
you. Okay, next we have P.S. Jaime for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You talked a little bit about the funding formula around policing in Indigenous communities. It had to have a 52% federal versus 48% provincial. Does that mean that if a provincial government refuses to fund that 48%, that our federal government is unable to spend that money in that province?
That's correct through the FNIPP. As I mentioned, I think earlier to another member, there exists some other funding streams that are not necessarily tailored specifically for First Nations and Inuit communities, where they can still provide funding through some of these other streams that are for specific activities such as drug communities where there's drug problems or severe criminality. But through the FNIPP, indeed, if the province cannot come up with 48%, then the federal is not going to spend the 52%. Or there's going to spend a lower amount that corresponds to 52% of what the province puts on the table.
So while that's a challenge, and as a federal MP, I'd love to be able to say, well, look, it's the provincial government that's not funding their portion of it, therefore we can't help the people who need it the best. But there are several different scenarios. Jordan's principle is an example of that, where people have said, you know, never mind the jurisdiction, let's make sure that the service is provided and then figure out how the funding can flow and who's responsible later. Is there a situation where the federal government can say, hey, we're going to pay for this, but we're going to come to the provinces after with a bill that says, here's 48% of the funds that, you know, that are required for this community to have, you know, the policing that they require?
It sounds, to your point, it sounds a lot like the Jordan's Principle program that's currently offered by the federal government under ISC. That the federal government was directed to undertake as a result of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal ruling. So, yes, there are other examples of that being done.
So I think that's, I think your job is a fascinating one because you're getting to the heart of the numbers on this. And what we really need to do is figure out, like you've said, we've tripled the funding since 2015 to 2025, but no community has come here and said everything's going swimmingly. In fact, they'll say, despite the fact that we've tripled the funding, that we've had less and less Indigenous police officers, less and less Indigenous people get recruited to go into police funding. How can we work? What are the lessons that we've learned from the 8 previous PBO reports that help us find solutions to this specific problem around Indigenous policing based on things that we've seen as best practices in other studies?
I would actually go back to advice that I received after we did the 3rd study at the behest of a former member of Parliament, Charlie Angus, who laid out the framework for me, which was, he asked me, so is it a funding problem, or is it a governance problem, or is it both? And I think in the vast majority of situations, it ends up being both. I think quantitatively, we don't know. Notwithstanding the consensus that there is underfunding at this point, I think we should actually put a number around it, the extent to which there is underfunding on a global basis, and obviously in communities across the countries, the level of underfunding is going to vary. So in the case of Garden River, the situation might be different in comparison to Akwesasne. From a governance perspective, that's something that is very much under the control of the federal government in terms of how they reach decisions and how they collaborate with not only First Nations, but also provincial governments. And that's something that, again, looking at other situations where the federal government offers substantial amounts of funding, and the way in which it's being provided doesn't provide a clear guarantee to the 634 First Nations who actually have to deliver on the programs. So the certainty around the funding over a longer-term period of time, flexibility around management of the funding, depending on the capacity of the First Nations, which of course varies across the country in terms of the capacity on the ground for those First Nations. And again, recognizing the unique challenges that First Nations are going to face and looking at the classification, the remoteness framework, so 1 through 4, and 4 being those flying communities across the country, taking that into account as well. But the easy part, we can solve, which is we can give you a number. If you give us 2 or 3 months and a motion from the committee, we can undertake the work, we can come back with a number. The hard part is left to the committee, which is sitting down and writing out the spaghetti process map, which Garden River needs to go through every year, from the federal government to the provincial government to other federal funding sources, provincial funding sources, and figuring out what the chief of Garden River actually has to navigate on an annual basis and how that can be simplified. Thankfully, that's not something that we have to get up to.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Chair, can I could you give me 30 seconds to ask one follow-up on that?
Everybody okay? Wait, go.
So considering that we're doing this in the end of December, we're going to have a long break between now and potentially late January when we come back. Would you be able to provide some information like that that helps us make the best recommendations possible for this study?
Yes, and it is contingent upon being able to obtain, I think it's less an issue of the data and it's more a question of the allocation framework. And that's why if we have a motion from the committee, I don't think, once we reach out to the Chief Financial Officer of the RCMP, I think they will respond to us very quickly with respect to their allocation framework or their calculation framework. And if you give us 3 months, you will have a beautiful report in both of Canada's official languages. If you need something sooner, we're happy to brief the committee on some preliminary findings. Yeah.
Yes, I'd like to move that, that we do that so that we get the best information to ensure that our recommendations are following what you've been able to uncover on this. And I'm hoping that the clerks can be a little bit patient before we go into our drafting instructions to that.
I understand what you're getting at. We will probably need some wording. We'll go to some questions, but if you want to just put down some wording that they can.
Does he have some idea what he wants the motion to look like?
Motion. So to repeat what, Monsieur Jacques, repeat what you had said about the motion that would be necessary to, that PS Jaime wants to move would be to give you the time.
It would be the simpler is better for everybody.
Yes.
And
Yes.
the simple motion would be that the Office of the Parliamentary Budget Officer prepare an estimate of the funding gap between the First Nations communities supported by federal and provincial programming versus non-First Nations communities.
Perfect. Everyone got that?
Just a quick question before.
Yep. Go ahead,
In that
Mr.
motion, Mr. Jacques, do we need a budget for pizza and pop as well? Or
I think
should we include that? Just thinking ahead
Yes.
here.
Very good. We'll provide the pizza and pop for sure. But so I'm going to deem that in order, and so moved by Jaime. And I look around the room, and all thumbs up. Good. Carried. Okay, we're getting towards the end, but we have a few more people asking questions. So, Deputy Lemire, 2.5 minutes.
Mr. Lemire.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Lemire, you have 2.5 minutes. Thank you. You said in your report that the PBO was not able to make a fulsome comparative analysis of the differences between Indigenous services and non-Indigenous services. For example, according to Statistics Canada, there's a $306 amount per individual. And in another area, there's a $289 per resident. So there are numbers you're giving per resident, and I'd like to know how you came to those numbers, and I'd like to know what explains the disparity. Is it underfunding? Is it structural? Or are there things lacking in the design? Well, on your first question on how we came to the numbers, we took the amount of funding that was provided through the FNIPP by the First Nation, through the First Nations and Inuit policing program. We looked at that amount, and that includes the federal portion and the provincial portion. So that's the total amount that police services would receive. And you divide that by the population in the territory in question. That's how we get to the number per person, depending on whether it's a territory or a community. So the amounts can look high. However, one important point to remember that was already mentioned in committee is that you can't simply compare the number of dollars being spent per inhabitant, because oftentimes these communities are very far away. Perhaps they're fly-in communities. They can be isolated. So even if there's a very small community, you can't just put a half a police officer in that community. You know, one of the previous witnesses was saying someone has to be there during the day, someone has to be there overnight or during big holidays. So even if the community is a small one, it still takes a minimum amount of resources, and that is costly per inhabitant. And I wasn't sure what else it was you wanted to know. Well, so it's not necessarily underfunding, even though there's been a 12% increase in funding, you're saying. Well, I think what's important is that we need fair funding, not necessarily equal funding. Because if you just look at dollars per person, well, you might think there's no underfunding problem at all. Thank you very much.
Next, we have MP Schmale for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Sharon. Thank you to our witnesses again. I want to pick up on something you had just finished off with Mr. Batiste a few moments ago, when you're talking about the application process that some of these chiefs would have to go through to figure this all out, and it's the yearly process that goes on and on and on. How do we get to the point? I would like one standardized reporting form for all departments, just to, in a perfect world, right? If I were king, that's what I would like to see. Having said that, is there a point where we can get to that allows the paperwork itself, the forms that need to be filled out to be more efficient? Is there an easy way to get there, I guess, first, but is there a will to get there as well on part of the government side, the bureaucracy side?
I think it's a question that's better put to the government themselves rather than.
What are your experience dealing with them? You said they gave you a whole slew of forms when you asked for them.
Yeah, I would say that specific example aside, I would say that looking at the projects that we've examined in the past, there is flexibility there has been in the past flexibility on the part of the government, and especially the public service, to change or lighten the reporting requirements and potentially standardize the reporting requirements. And again, recognizing that the 634 First Nations plus other Indigenous communities across the country, there are differing levels of need and differing levels of capacity that you're dealing with. So having one single form for everybody potentially doesn't necessarily make sense.
It doesn't make sense if you're increasing your capacity to deal with the different forms from different departments at different times. So
I would actually think it's the inverse. So not singling any particular Indigenous community or First Nation out, if there's greater capacity and thinking of channeling my inner CPA and my outer CPA, the audit approach when you're going through a company which has well-established control frameworks, where you know that they can keep track of the money fairly well and they have a good policy suite, you're doing less, right? As part of the overall audit test, you have a lot more confidence in terms of what you're looking at, as opposed to a situation where you start to go and look at a company, you ask them for their policies around petty cash, they don't have it, you ask them where the petty cash is, they don't know. At that point, it starts to give you pause, and you think, okay, we actually need to look at this in greater detail. So I do think, and again, it's the challenge, and the government has indicated this themselves in terms of their engagement with Indigenous communities and First Nations, that you can't, for the First Nations that have much greater capacity, it's potentially more efficient and more reasonable for everybody to actually treat them in with a lighter touch in a more professional way, recognizing that they know what they're doing.
Of course, yes, absolutely. Yeah, it's just the smaller communities are the ones that build in capacity that are going to have the problem with that. I just want to go back to probably a few reports ago. I can't remember how long it was. Sorry. When you're looking at the Department of ISC, I know obviously this is public safety that we're dealing with, but I think with the reporting standards, it does have some merit. The fact that ISC is a bureaucracy that, in its own mandate, has said they want to put themselves out of a job, but they've doubled in size since their creation. Previous reports of your department have said funding has increased substantially in that department, yet the outcomes are not equal to or even close to the funding levels. And so when we look at this program again, the problems that we continue to see, are we able to get to a place here in the Indigenous Policing Service without a major overhaul of the program?
I think that's a question that's better put to the Auditor General or the Deputy Minister, two Deputy Ministers of the.
True, it was the Auditor General, but you're
and again, from our side, and again going back and looking at the other funding gap reports that we prepared in the past, there's certainly opportunities on the governance side to improve things, and I recall we prepared a 2013 report with respect to capital funding for the federal government for First Nations schools in British Columbia. We administered a survey with First Nations communities in British Columbia to collect the data. We thought it was primarily a data and an accounting story, and it was very interesting because what came out immediately as part of the results was we found that the schools that were being built were very, very large in First Nations communities, and there was a lot of additional capacity. And when we started to poke and prod and ask questions around it, the response was, well, you receive a phone call from Ottawa once every 30 to 40 years, and they say, congratulations, you're at the top of the list, we're going to build you a new school. And so you know you're not going to receive that phone call again for a very long time. So you build the school that you think you might need over the next 20 to 30 years. So certainly on the governance side, that was in 2013. I'm optimistic things have improved since then. And at the same time, certainly on this, potentially there end up being governance improvements.
Thank you very much. And that concludes today's meeting. I'm going to look around the room to see, yep, they're okay, and everyone's okay. Ça va? Well, t'es tout fini. Okay, meeting adjourned. Merci to our, from you, and we look forward to more information.